Information Sources. My name is Jodie Heap. I am the Scholarly Communications and Research Support Librarian here at Keele University. The session today will focus on considering how we go about evaluating information. We'll have a bit of a look at some evaluation frameworks that can be used. There are many frameworks that exist that can be used to evaluate information, so I've picked out my favourite three, and we're going to have a consideration of those frameworks and a link to and use of them in relation to AI and how AI has changed how we consider and evaluate information. And we're going to have to think about as well how to strengthen our skills in managing and evaluating that information in relation to research. So hopefully that sounds good to you. For the majority of the session, I will simply present, but towards the end, I will throw in a couple of questions. And if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to ask along the way, please do pop them into the chat. So one of the sort of major questions really with this session is, why does it matter? Why does evaluation matter? And this is a really interesting question, to me at least. I am an information scientist, I'm a librarian, I handle information, I help people access information. And one of the higher levels of education is centering around this element of critical thinking and considering a information product in front of us and knowing how that applies to other pieces of information that we have come across and considering it. And this is becoming a harder task than previous generations. We are in an information revolution at the moment. So just like we went through a agricultural revolution and other, the industrial revolution, we are now going through an information revolution where we have the internet and we have mass communication and mass production and easier means of production of curating and sharing information, and that certainly applies within an academic environment as well as a more generalized public environment. So there's more academic literature than ever before, there's more grey literature than ever before, and all of it is available, or most of it is available online. The issue with this is it does tend to lean towards more misinformation and disinformation as people don't understand what they are coming across, or how it is shared and reported is perhaps skewed, perhaps incorrectly. There are, of course, bad actors. Clickbait is certainly one way of enticing people to be like, the science says this, all of that exists. And yeah, we're having access to the academic literature and it's not necessarily being processed and handled or considered before having mass consumption. Yeah, that's an area of my interests. And then on top of that, now we have AI software, which can do different things. So I always think of AI as a Swiss Army knife, lots of different tools that do different jobs. And sometimes they're useful for the task at hand, and sometimes it's not. I don't always need a tiny knife. Sometimes I do need a little spoon. Different AI products can be used to support or hinder the task that I am trying to achieve, and specifically when we consider how information is being employed into that process, it becomes very important for us to consider how that information was produced and to have a critical evaluation of who, how, what, why, when, who was involved, what biases might that process have. There's a lot to consider, particularly with the additional element of AI on top of all the information that we have. So one of the recommendations that I have for sort of calming ourselves down about how to tackle this information overload is to use evaluation frameworks. Now, the thing is, a framework is just that. It's just a system that we can use to support us in approaching an evaluation task. Not all frameworks are going to be applicable for every task. Frameworks are just a jumping off point, a bit like going to the gym, of building up our evaluation skills muscles so that we can move away from a framework in the long run. So frameworks are useful in that initial process of giving us structure to grade something against, but they're sort of the starting point, not necessarily the end point. And as we become more adept at using specific types of information and using that framework, we can start to see how we can learn for ourselves to ask those pertinent questions. When we see a piece of information, we can have different elements of our own criteria that we might want to bring forward. So why do we use frameworks? Well, one of the tasks, really, one of the elements that they support is to reduce the cognitive overload. When we are considering lots of information, and specifically if it's different types, different product types, it can be really overwhelming and mentally draining. And I often say my brain has pulled out my ears because sometimes things are just really hard to process, and it's really nice to have a system in place to take some of that cognitive load off of us. And it ties into this work around reproducibility and reliability, specifically in research is a big conversation that we're having at the moment. And by using a framework, we can indicate to readers, for example, or other researchers, or just, in conversation, this consistency and transparency of how we have evaluated the information and arrived at our conclusions. So we can point to the framework as supporting the conversation, and we can, share our notes, etc., of how we have applied this process to evaluate that product and whether we deem it to be of a high quality or a lower quality. It of course supports critical thinking. It helps us scaffold our learning into having that critical assessment of that product. And yeah, it's not really a shortcut, to be honest, because you have to go through that process of understanding why we would make those judgments and why we make the assessments that we do in relation to that information and why that is pertinent to us. It's useful because there are different frameworks against different products and different formats and contexts. So again, using the right framework allows us to remove some of that hard work and do some of that heavy lifting for us by having a predefined sort of thinking happening for us, wherein we can see what are the critical elements for that product. Again, I appreciate some of this is a little vague at the moment, but when we get into the specific frameworks, that'll become a bit clearer. And then again, it ties into the ethical and responsible research practices. So being able to recognise that evaluation approaches are different, but we can use these frameworks to support that process and communicate them with others. Okay. Okay, so the first framework that I want to introduce you to, you might have already heard it. Give me a thumbs up if you have heard of the CRAP test before. She's an oldie, but she is a goldie. Yeah, a couple of you, yeah. So this is one that we often introduce at undergraduate level because saying the CRAP test makes everybody laugh. And I am a child at heart, so it still makes me chuckle. But it's a nice one because it is used in typical academic context. So it highlights to us certain elements that we might want to consider. So the currency of the information, when was it produced? If I'm working in 2026 and I'm looking at something from the 1900s, as the youth say, I've heard, then maybe that information is not so timely anymore for my needs. Next is looking at the relevance. Perhaps the title appeared relevant to me, but actually when I get into the abstract or the specifics of the information, it doesn't actually meet my needs for my information search. This one is my favourite one, is authority. And it's the credentials of the author or the source. And this is a really interesting question to me, because what makes someone have credentials, in my opinion? Is it a piece of paper? Is it a qualification from an established university or designation of education establishment? Is it lived experience? Are they well known in the industry as having expertise? So it's not as straightforward as it might initially appear. For example, I know that there are some really good YouTubers who specialize in certain areas, and if they were to tell me some information, I would probably be quite believing of them and what they propose, versus someone unknown who I hadn't established a level of author credential in my mind. So yeah, authority is a really interesting one to me, because is it, being published? Is it, peer review? Is it, yeah, it's a good one, particularly for sort of historical writing publications, I would say. And part of the answer to that question really comes into the answer around accuracy. Is that author's information aligning with what I know to be accurate and correct? Can I map it across? Are they able to tell me where they sourced their information from? There's a certain level of accuracy in what is being delivered in that information that would engage my historical knowledge of the situation and the problem. And this is part of the reason why we encourage a breadth of reading around a topic and never just picking one source of information. Yeah, literature reviews essentially exist because we want to map the conversation around a topic, around a problem, and see if there is an alignment that is occurring between independent authors. The final P is for purpose, and it's the reason the information exists. This one, again, I find to be a very fascinating conversation, because the paper could have met all the other criteria, but then I see that they are actually funded by a corporation. And so there's a potential maybe of bias in the reporting of their results. The example I always used to give is I think Lucozade sponsored some research into whether energy drinks gave sports athletes or athletes better performance. And they did find a small correlation in super high athletes. If they did have energy drinks, there was a slightly better performance. And then they ran a giant campaign saying, their energy drink made you a better athlete, which is, it's not wrong, but it's not quite right either. So what is the purpose that information has been produced for? And is that ethically aligning with the expectations that we would have for research and that information product? So what we can do is use an example scenario of a academic journal which we have found, and we want to use within the support of our literature review. So when we look at the CRAP, we can look at when was the article published, is the research still relevant, does the article directly address the research question, level and discipline that we need. We can consider who is the author and are they affiliated with a recognised institution, is the journal itself reputable. Never forget there are predatory journals who have questionable acceptance practices. Then there is the accuracy of the information. So is the methodology clearly explained? Are claims supported by evidence and references? And is the article intended to inform, persuade, or promote a particular viewpoint? So CRAP is particularly effective for traditional academic sources where publication details and methodology are explicitly stated. So she's an oldie, but she's a good one. I like the CRAP test. Just have a sip. Okay, so the next one is called SIFT, and it is particularly useful when we are considering science, for example, science claims, um, news articles and things that are a bit more generalized to, I'll say the internet, things you might find or come across where someone's made a claim about a new drug or a treatment or something that has gone on. And it asks us to stop, to pause before we engage with that content. So before we immediately jump into make a comment or like or dislike or share it with someone, can we investigate the source? Where has this claim come from? Is it reputable? Can we find better coverage of this new piece of information elsewhere? Has there been some different types of reporting on it? And can we trace the claim back to the original context? So perhaps a journal article has come out and then it's reported in the news, but they have slightly different perspective or a bias on how they're reporting the information. So SIFT is quite nice if you come across something on, say, social media and it, catches your interest, but you want to follow it back and then dig deeper into something like the CRAP test, for example. So here we have an example of a news article frequently shared on social media that relates to your research topic. You think, great, yeah, that sounds good. So what it asks us to do is to pause before sharing or citing it. What's our initial reaction to what is being presented to us? A lot of things on the internet are intended to be reactionary, black and white and polarizing. So just take a pause and think about what the intention is by sharing this information. We can ask ourselves who's behind the website or the organisation and what is their reputation. Is it something from a charity? Is it something from a political group or an organisation that maybe has an intention affiliated with it? We can look to see if they are being reported by credible outlets, multiple outlets reporting the same information, and what are the different people saying. So looking to people on the left and to the right, and if there's any central perspectives as well, that piece of information might be shared quite differently depending on who is reporting on it. And can we trace those claims back to the original source? I can't going to quite remember it now. There was quite an interesting one fairly recently, which is someone shared a statistic and then it got shared again and shared again and shared again through quite reputable companies, and when it was tried to be traced back, there was no originating source. So there's no way of actually seeing if that statistic is factually true or not, but because it was shared by one reputable organisation, it then spread because they were trusted instead of being questioned about that information. So it's quite easy for misinformation and disinformation to occur, even innocently, that misinforms people. It's more common than we think. Okay. The third framework that I would like to introduce is a little bit similar to CRAP, but there are subtle differences that make it, I think, more applicable within our AI emerging world, and it's RADAR. And it asks us, is this information relevant? Okay, does it fit the need? Okay, who is the author, who produced it, the date, when was it created? So very similar. Then we're looking into accuracy, evidence, peer review, and references. So ChatGPT, AI systems might produce something that looks very reputable, but we have to ask ourselves, where is it pulling that information from? And what biases might it have in its original data sources and within the production of the information itself? And again, this touches on the reason of why something might be written. Is there a specification in the prompt that might accidentally direct the answer into a particular direction? So the example that we've got is to use an AI tool to generate a summary of a topic or identify key themes. So we're looking to use the AI software to create a summary of the articles, or we're using a product which can help search and aggregate the information. Again, these are becoming more and more popular, and they have their pros and they definitely have their cons. So how radar can be applied is by looking at if the output aligns with your research aims and the academic context, looking at what sources the content is based on and are the references provided and verifiable. And in the library, certainly we are seeing a massive rise in references that are not real. They just look good, they sound right, there might be an element of truth, that author might exist, but they definitely don't write that paper for that journal, and it's making things quite difficult to check and verify that the products being requested are actually real. And this is a concern more widely because, okay, they have the pattern down of the referencing styles, but the information that they are pulling through may not be fully correct. Okay. The date, again, a problem with AI is it presents information as though it is up to date, but it may not be. It may not have access to the most up to date information, and it may just conflate or combine sources of information. Yeah, the date is a big one for me, particularly with AI products. Yeah, is the appearance of the information polished in such a way that it may obscure gaps or uncertainty? AI tends to be more positive. It tries its best to please you, and sometimes that will obfuscate gaps that we might have in our research, or the capacity it has to find that information. And that's not helpful to us if we are trying to research a topic. We want to look for the gaps and talk about them. And finally, of course, the reason for creation. Why does this content exist, and what are the limitations and biases of the tool? It's a big one with the sort of summarization softwares that are being used. Is there a bias with the supplier of the information? Are we guaranteed neutrality in the production of the summarizations in the articles that are being included? Thus far, I've not been able to ascertain the neutrality of these products, and that really begs the question for their application within research. So an ongoing discussion to be had for sure. It's quite exciting on the one hand because it's an emerging area, and anything that makes the life in doing research easier is the thing that we want. But then on the other hand, if it's not really been utilized and built correctly, it's not useful to us. So yeah, I'll be interested to see if we start getting institutions purchasing products. Anyway, so this is just a moment for us to catch our breath, think about the frameworks that I have shown you. You might be aware of other frameworks. Do let me know if you have a favourite framework. Perhaps not as nerdy as me, completely understandable. But what I want you to think about is what do you think these frameworks are designed to do? So Craft, SIFT and Radar, thinking about which framework feels most intuitive, most academic and most useful for everyday information. So just how you might stop and pause at the different stages of your life and maybe think about how you could use each of the different frameworks. For me, I'm quite good at critical thinking when I am at work. I am less switched onto it perhaps when I'm just mooching on social media or navigating the internet for pleasure reading, going onto websites and seeing what the news of the day is. It's not something that I'm always immediately thinking, I wonder who the author is. And that tends to be the point where actually I trip up and I see something and I believe it, but I haven't actually followed the thread through to see if it's true and believable. So it's quite interesting to me to think about how do we think critically in our lives in all areas. So yeah, so yeah, where do you think these tools might work well, and where are they going to be limited? And do you see any situations where one framework might be more appropriate than others, particularly in your different areas of study? So I'm just going to pause for just a moment, a minute or so, just so you can have a think about that, and I can catch my breath. And if you have any thoughts you would like to share, do pop them in the chat, and I'll just give that 30 seconds or so for you to think about that. Yeah. So I see Chris has said, all useful, especially for content on social media. Yeah, I think the social media one is a slow burn because you kind of forget to think critically about it, or at least I do. So yeah, thank you. Okay, so the main thing really when we're discussing evaluation frameworks is there are lots of different frameworks, and they are really useful to helping us start to consider how we might evaluate a particular piece of information if this is something that we've not really thought about before. So, you know, we might have an awareness of how we approach thinking critically. But when we take a step back and sort of do the meta cognitive analysis of how do we think about evaluating, a framework can be quite useful in aligning with our own understandings of how we might assess something, and how that is going to be slightly different depending on the location and the how that product was born into the world. Is it a purely digital product? Is it a purely physical product? What is the publishing and production route for that information to before it is consumed by me? And different frameworks are useful in aligning our thinking of how we might assess that information. System quick to use in for everyday information. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. So the main takeaway that I would like you to take from the discussion around frameworks is you can absolutely have a look to see if there is a framework that matches the source of information that you would like to critically evaluate, and it's a jumping off point to help us move forward in that critical thinking process. It's not a tick list. Different pieces of information may or may not be applicable, but it helps us sort of build up those muscles, mentally speaking. So, one of the biggest conversations that we have to have really is around the AI factor. And I've already touched on this with the radar framework. But AI tools, particularly within research, are acting as intermediaries between us and the information product. And that it does have risks. You know, we always talk about Chinese whispers when we are talking about academic research. You know, Smith said what, John said what, and we're comparing and we're contrasting. And when we take a step back from that immediate source of information and bring in an intermediary, there are going to be risks, there are going to be dangers, that we might mishear or misconstrue the information that is being presented to us. So one of the biggest issues really around AI acting as an intermediary is around the hallucinations, and there are steps being taken to mitigate the rate at which false information and hallucinations occur within the AI tools. You know, for example, closed systems, which is where the AI tool can only access academic information. That said, it's not 100%. And even in the tools that I've seen that are specifically for academic research, academic use, you know, it's still sort of in the zone of 95% correct, which is a 5% error in information reporting. To me is quite concerning. You know, so it means that I would have to go through and look at all the articles to confirm if the original article matches the summary or the aggregate information that is being presented to me, which seems like a lot more work at the moment. As I kind of touched on as well, there's a lack of clear provenance. So a lack of clarity around where this AI tool has accessed the data, the source of the information to pull through these articles. Is it within, you know, is it legal? Have the authors approved? Have there been contracts signed with publishers? There's a lot of concern at the moment about AI scraping, and it's an ongoing conversation to be had. And for me, if I'm going to use a AI tool or product, I would want to be confident in the provenance of the information and that it's all ethically being accessed, and you know, I can be happy that I can move forward with the information that I have. Again, one of the issues we have is with the bias of the training data. There are issues in research, there are issues in how things are reported. The authors might have conscious or unconscious biases that is then consumed by the AI tools, and those biases are amplified through into the outputs that they produce. I know one experiment where they were presenting the same symptoms, but if you were a male, you got a more positive response, and if you were female, you got a more negative response. And so we need to be really cognizant of that as users of these tools, to not then further worsen the situation of these biases that are coming through into these systems. They might not be immediately explicitly obvious to us. And of course, as critical, independent thinkers, we want to build up our muscles to access information and think critically, and we don't want to have an over-reliance on these outputs just being generated for us. I think of a lot of this as the sort of takeout of the information world. Sometimes, you know, you just want something quick, cheap and easy to consume, but actually it's not very good for you, and your foundations need to be built on having a confidence in the accuracy of the information that you are consuming. Certainly, you know, the benefits are there. There is a speed in finding leads and areas of interest. It's really nice to have something summarize a complex text for us. Journal articles, they're hard to read. They just are. They are using hyper-specific language and talking in a hyper-specific tone of voice and trying to navigate you through the details of a complex research project via text. It's just hard. So sometimes it is really nice to have a bit of a brain break and have something summarize something for us. And what I do like, and this is I think my favorite way to use AI tools, is to generate new search directions, particularly if we're looking at something maybe from an interdisciplinary angle. It might be that the computer program can connect some dots that we hadn't considered from our specific you know, lens, and that can be quite useful to then go off and do further research and investigate, is this an avenue that we could look into? So I do like them for certain elements of the process. I think it's just that over reliance that is a real concern. Okay, so how do I propose that AI fits into evaluation and accessing of information? And ultimately, I would suggest that it is a stage between Google Scholar and sort of a dedicated database. So I have grabbed this image from a different slide deck, but essentially what I'm proposing is that AI research assistant tools, software tools, products, whatever of the Swiss Army knife elements you are using, it helps us act as a jumping off point before we jump into doing our own research. It's better than just Google or Google Scholar, where there is no ability to drill down, there's no real capacity to understand how those programs have produced that information for us. Semantic searching is, yeah. Much going on with Google as an example of a basic web search. Anyway, the research assistants sort of live in that twilight zone wherein they have access to some information that may or may not be academic, and they can produced short, sharp summaries. They can be used within a specific tool set, a specific database to aggregate that content for us. And then I would be most interested in then taking it further and going direct to that product and reading it for myself. So I do think AI fits into the research process, and I think it doesn't replace that end goal of having access to the articles, sitting down and reading them and thinking critically about that information. But it can be used to, excuse me, direct us into areas that we might not have considered before. Yeah, so good conversation in the chat about how biased information, AI information can be. But I do like it as a starting point. Sometimes, it's like when we're looking at a blank Word document, you think, don't know where to start, I don't know what to do. So sometimes it's quite nice to ask the AI, where would you start? And then that gives us an ease into navigating into more specific areas. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. I'm just quite chatty today. So ultimately, what I am saying is that AI and the information, it's a changing landscape. New products are emerging all the time. The way people are making deals in the background to improve the software so that we have more trusted and reliable information. That is an ongoing conversation at the moment. Currently, all very expensive, but I imagine as we progress in time, that will become more cheaper, better deals will be negotiated. AI and that element of summarization is here to stay, and tools will become popular, more products will emerge, and we need to have a understanding of how we can engage with and safely use those products. And evaluation of the information becomes a really important skill in our researcher toolkit. It's the thing that will help us differentiate ourselves from the mass public into being, researchers of a specific area, or of operating at a certain standard of information, is our ability to understand how information is produced, crafted, shared, summarized and smooshed together. These are all skills that will become more and more important as we progress forward in time. So when you are looking at evaluating AI outputs, apply a element of critical thinking, use perhaps a framework, really think about checking the citations. Can you trace them back to their original sources? Do they even exist? Use AI as a starting point, not as an end point. Okay, it's a jumping off product. It is not the end goal. And always cross-verify the information that is being produced by these tools with authoritative sources that exist elsewhere. So that's my tips for AI elements of the world at the moment. Again, a little takeaway activity that you can do after this session: use AI to generate an answer that you might have to a research question. consider one of the frameworks that I have presented here and think about, did the AI output meet the scholarly standards that we would expect it to? Probably not, but not always. Okay. Again, this is a last question, and I am going to take about 3 or 4 minutes for everyone to have a think about this. And again, if you feel comfortable to pop an answer in the chat, how has AI changed the way that you find, assess, or use information in your research and studies? And what feels easier and what feels more uncertain with that? So I'll give us 3 minutes, so that'll be 10:52. I'll just hang out here, but just take a minute to think about how has information access changed for you. Wonderful. Some really good conversation going on in the chat. And I think this is it for me. The additional burden of having to then go check everything it said to me makes it not actually a faster process, but it's quite nice to have that conversation with it sometimes and just bounce ideas off it. Let's see. That's it. Louisa, I like that idea. I'll have to play around with that one. Yeah, good idea. Yeah, I like that. Hmm. I might borrow it for a session. Oh, love that. Library nerds unite. Yeah, I think a lot of people think as a librarian I'd be anti-AI, and I'm not anti-AI. I use it quite a lot, but I think part of the critical evaluation conversation is having this understanding of when it would be appropriate and when it wouldn't be, and that is a skill that we have to learn, um, just like anything else. Okay. I'll carry on coming back to the chat because I've just got a few more slides to finish off on. Um, so I might dip in and out, but yeah, carry on. Good answers, guys. Yeah, so essentially, just to round off this conversation around the AI element, particularly when we're thinking about critically evaluating, is one of the issues that we're tackling with in research at the moment, particularly with the public, is um, trustworthiness of having the public understand and trust that the research is being done ethically and professionally, and is that we can evidence the effort and the work and the logic and the reasoning behind how we've come to the conclusions that we have done. And this means that we need to be transparent in acknowledging our use of AI. Again, in journal articles, particularly things that are recently published, people are starting to acknowledge how they have used AI to support the writing of the journal article. And this for me ties into the conversation around the credit framework, which is where we're acknowledging who did what in terms of the authorship, who was the statistician, who was part of the writing team, who was part of the data gathering team. And then the next level really being that AI element where we acknowledge, it was used for grammatical purposes or it was, whatever it was used for. That is brand new and emerging. So it's interesting to see how people are approaching that as a problem. And yeah, basically, I just think it's important that we acknowledge our use of AI and state how and when we used it so that we can have this conversation with our colleagues and the wider community that will be consuming the products that we are outputting ourselves. And we need to have cognizance of how these tools are created and how they can support us correctly. And one of the biggest issues really surrounds institutional and publisher policies. Does the institution allow us to use these tools in the way that we would like to? And does the publisher, the person who processes our output, what are their standards and expectations, and what would they accept? So there's a growth in this area, and it's certainly something to be aware of. And I would really encourage you as you move forward in your research studies to acknowledge AI in whatever capacity that you have used it in your work. At the moment, there's a bit of a secretive, like, shh, don't tell anyone kind of vibe to it because I think it's emerging and not everybody is pro AI. Some people are like purely human and whatever, but I think it's used a lot more than is admitted to, and we need to start removing that stigma by acknowledging how we are using it so that we can build up the strength of the conversation around how it can be used safely, securely, and we're having that transparency around our research practices. Um, there's a lot of change at the moment, and I just want to take a second to acknowledge that in with you guys. This is a researcher integrity is it's a big conversation at the moment because we are in this information revolution. We're in this really changeable landscape. We're having to deal with things that have not necessarily occurred before, and so there's not necessarily case studies, there's not necessarily best practice in place, and so we need to use whatever processing internal ethical guidance that we have to ask ourselves does that feel right and correct, and would I happily tell others about it? And I think that those are quite simple questions that we can use to support us when we are engaging in evaluating information, and specifically that AI element that overlaps a lot of the work that is going on at the moment. I do want to highlight there is a really nice resource called Embracing AI with Integrity from the UKRIO, and the link is there. If you just Google it, it will come up. So I can highly recommend, if you have some more questions that you would like to investigate about how we can embrace and engage with AI and still maintain our integrity as researchers. It's a really nice one. Okay, so just a last couple of slides now. It's basically lots of threads being pulled on you as researchers. We have to operate within environments that are shaped by pressures, performances and metrics, and an expectation to publish. And so that can lead us towards wanting to use digital tools, which includes AI. And so we need to just have a consideration of how that product can be used correctly within our workflow process. These pressures can increase the risk and the temptation of over-reliance on AI tools, and just generally taking shortcuts is never going to be a good thing, but it's super tempting, and sometimes it is possible. I really like the notebook's suggestion, for example, as a way of speeding up the finding of our citations that we know we've read and we've run outtakes on them. So that is a nice example. And by acknowledging these pressures and talking about them with others, we can help practice, our ethical informed decision making moving forward. So talk to your peers, whether they're in your subject specialism or not, about how they're engaging with handling information and using AI within that scope. So to pull the session together on evaluating information sources, it's really important that we evaluate all information that we come across, whether that is in our professional lives or our personal lives. There are a plethora of frameworks that can be used to support that process. It's important we stay aware of the legal and ethical boundaries that exist within the realms that we are engaging in, and just keep thinking of yourself, take a step back and think of yourself as a critical, reflective researcher. What would that person do? How would they handle this situation? And I find that works quite well to steer us in the correct direction. If you would like some further resources, you can see them here. So we've got the Vitae research, I forgot what it's called. The research framework. I do know, but it's completely gone. But that is really good and has been updated fairly recently. We also have library guides from the Keele University that cover these products, and also externally you can go and look up the frameworks and the UKRIO guidance. In this session, we have looked at the different frameworks that are available. We've looked at how AI fits into that situation, and we've considered how we can look at researcher integrity when we are considering research and looking and evaluating information. Okay, huzzah, just within time. Thank you very much for sticking through with me and chatting with me. I've really enjoyed this session and I appreciate your time. If you do have any questions or discussions, you feel free to hang out and ask them. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I will hang on just for a few more minutes and we can chat about things if you want to, or if not, you can feel free to log off and carry on with the rest of your day.